Okay, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to having this conversation. It is drawn from the book that I'm working on, which was inspired by by the election in 2016. And some people seem to be despair. And I figured, well, I've been around a long time. I've seen a lot of trouble in this country, and sometimes we've overcome it well, sometimes not so well. And the thought that the work that I and many of people here have been doing for many years on constructive conflicts has some application to this country, even though most of my work has been on international affairs. So in this little presentation, I wanted to apply the constructive conflict approach, but focus here on what the implications are, particularly when you're dealing within the United States with institutionalized ways of handling conflict, as well as what we usually focus on in the field, which is the less institutionalized ways. So first of all, I wanted to say, well, how do I back up? What's the criteria for deciding what's better and what's worse? In the books, I've often referred to international notions about human rights. But for America, there are certain criteria. We have a Declaration of Independence. I don't know, can everybody read that or know it by heart? And then there's the Pledge of Allegiance, which those of us who grew up in this country recited every day at the beginning of class. And then there's the American Creed, which Gunnar Myrdal, who was a Swedish social scientist who was invited to come to America to figure out what will happen with race relations here. And he wrote, and with many colleagues, a book called The American Dilemma, An American Dilemma, referring to race relations. In the book, I rarely use the word race because I'm a sociologist and I know better. There's ethnic relations indeed, and race is the way it is in America is really an ethnic relationship. But anyway, he felt, Gunnar Myrdal, that there was a creed which read like all the other statements, saying that there's equality for all, and justice. These are American creed. So those are the goals in deciding what's a better and worse conflict. The methods are the constructive conflict ideas. And I won't try to go over them, because I want to just focus on what does it mean to do this in the United States. So one of the things is that there are institutionalized ways. There's a government, there's a constitution, there are laws, there are courts, and a lot of the conflicts are dealing with that somehow. Take the civil rights struggle, a magnificent example of constructive conflict. Of course, we've developed the theory partly because of the experience, so there's a coherence there. But take a look, even with the use of the courts, you think there was a Supreme Court decision in 1954, which took them 2 years to decide, because they wanted it to be unanimous and they were having trouble formulating it in a way that they could agree on. But that was the result of cases which are brought to the Supreme Court, cases that the NAACP, particularly Thurgood Marshall, as the leading lawyer there, carefully took step by step. There were a dozen, 2 dozen cases before that one, and they chose one from Topeka, Kansas. Why they do that? Where the equality and the conditions in the schools were pretty equal, actually, but there was segregation, and so they could point to that, and they helped construct this decision, which was that segregation was inherently unequal. And that became the law of the land, even though the case and the condition presumably was some problem in the South. And that was true of what Martin Luther King did. They take one city and say that a law here is bad, and they boycott that. And then there's a court decision, and then there's a law, which is national, and nationalized this. It was brilliant, and they always appealed to the creed, to the notion that this is a land of equal opportunity and justice for all. And how could you argue against that? And of course, they had the perfect adversary in Bull Connor and the quite destructive ways of countering it, which was to behave as badly as you can imagine. And so together with the bad way of responding and the brilliant way of presenting the problem, they did overcome a great deal. But the other principle that is true in domestic conflicts is the relations that go on forever. They never end. The conflicts never end. And they're always connected with the past, with anticipations, with what's going on in one place, what's going on in another. There undoubtedly are victories and backsliding and constructive and destructive behavior. I wanted to point to one example of that for one issue, which I'm later going to hand out a whole bunch of paper, a list of books, so you can have some footnotes to this talk. Housing in America is extraordinarily segregated and has been, and part of it, in good measure, has been due to the behavior of the government of the United States and to local governments. People more or less knew that this was not good and had problems. And in 1963, for example, we're all very conscious here now of I-81, a highway which went right along the edge and went into part of what was the African American community, which still was just near downtown. And in the 60s, there was not only building of highways consciously designed to disrupt African American neighborhoods where they were in desirable locations, like near the downtown, which should be valuable and used for other purposes. And then there was the matter of urban renewal, which meant get rid of those slums where the African Americans happen to be living. And what we refer to here as the old 15th Ward, there was protest. But the protests never got organized nationally. There were protests in many cities in the United States. Here, I came to Syracuse in '62, so I had the opportunity to join this protest, though I wasn't arrested, I confess. But many of my colleagues were, and many graduate students and undergraduates and local people. They mentioned particularly CORE. We had a very strong CORE chapter here, an NAACP chapter. But it didn't carry much weight. We weren't able to mobilize that at any national level, even though the problem was national, and the federal government had a good thing to say about it. And the other very complicated issue that is kind of ongoing. In my book, I was going to have one chapter on class, one on status, and one on power. Well, the one on class is now 3 chapters. What can I say? But it is the interesting thing, and it was, I used to teach a class in social inequality, and I saw it never changed during the period that I was teaching it. As soon as I stopped, it began to rise in the 1970s, and it's been rising exponentially ever since. I attribute no causal connection, but it is an amazing story, and now we talk about it now. But and then there's talk of, well, there's automation and trade and all these other big forces that are accountable for it. Except that those worldwide forces are experienced by countries all over the world, but in no other country has there been the extraordinary increase in inequality as we've witnessed here. And I'll return to that, though. Let's see. Oh, I do have another slide that's relevant. PATCO. I don't know if you can read that. PATCO are the air traffic controllers who, in 1981, went on strike. And Reagan struck. Reagan was new president, and he fired them all and declared that they will never be hired again by the federal government. Well, that's an example, I think, of great skill by Reagan for very wrong purposes, because it certainly was a strike against trade unionism, and in a form that it emboldened every employer in the country to say, you don't have to just negotiate, you can play tough. So the message were sort of clear for Reagan and for some of the corporations. It should also have been a message to the strikers that they overreached. It was an illegal strike. And that's not a good thing to base your strike on. And they suffered. The union was, of course, just ended a new union was formed later. But overreach is a big problem for everybody. It's hard not to overreach if you're winning, or if you think you're very strong. And you go too far, and the backlash comes. So that's part of the constructive conflict approach, is to take into account the interests and concerns of the opponents. And it's worth being aware of what they are, partly because you know better how to fight them if you understand that, but also because there may be kinds of concessions which you can make which don't cost you very much, but which placate the opposition, so a backlash is less likely to occur. Thirdly, in domestic conflicts, there's the possibility of persuasive inducements are relatively important. In constructive conflict approach, we emphasize that there are conflicts are not just waged with coercion. Some people define conflicts as when you try to hurt somebody. But conflicts don't necessarily mean hurting. They could be done by persuasion. You try to argue with somebody, and some arguments are always given as to why we're doing this, why we want this, why you should give it to us. The third one is benefits. You promise them you'll be better off. If you give me what I want, you'll gain this. When the direct nonviolent action was taken in the civil rights struggle, the promise was always there. Well, you'll have more business from us. We'll all be better off if you have better workers and customers if we get something more out of it. There was always that built-in promise, but the persuasion per se is really important in domestic struggles because we do share some common interests inevitably, and often some common values. I think the Martin Luther King was brilliant in formulating what he was doing in terms of being persuasive about the American creed, American doctrine of Christian sentiments. But I'm going to give you one other case of very effective persuasion. This is the Tea Party protests. How the hell could people believe that they would be better off without better medical care provisions? How could they be? How could they be organized to think that a government plan which would offer more benefits to more people was a bad thing? Well, it's a long history. And it goes the same with the history of how did we get so unequal in this country. The Republican Party became more and more right-wing, was less so when both parties were a little less doctrinaire. But there were certainly big funders, Koch brothers notably, but many others. There were think tanks, and little formulas like, well, as Reagan said, The government isn't the cure, the government is the problem. And what we could do is cut taxes, and everybody will have their own more of their own money to spend the way they want. And in a way, the gains that had been made in the 50s kind of undermined themselves because more people were doing better. And they could say, yeah, I could have lower taxes. And that's good. I could do with that. And there were even interests because they were getting IRAs and benefits which were dependent upon the stock market. Well, they had an interest in the stock market going up. And that was sold to people. And they convinced that if there were tax cuts and you decrease government spending because you don't need it anyway, and you will be better off. And this was said over and over again and convinced a lot of people. And so I think the Tea Party became an epitome of that. It was very effective, I would say destructively, because the end result, the goal was to decrease equality and decrease and to increase inequality. And that's what they're saying there. Cut taxes. And the taxes, when they got cut, somehow always gave greater benefits to the rich people than to the poorer people. That's the odd. Somehow that never got picked up with mass mobilization. The Occupy Wall Street raised some visibility, but they didn't really make clear what the alternative was. There was no program. There was no goal set. Saul Alinsky, how many of you have heard of Saul Alinsky? Okay, I'm from Chicago, so I know Saul Alinsky was a community organizer, and he wrote a couple books about it. When I was in college, he came, gave us a talk. There was a strike going on, and I still remember he said, "You'll learn more if you go to jail for a day than you will in school." And so the next day I joined a picket line, but I didn't get arrested. I just want to make sure we really have time to talk. So I'm just going to conclude with just a few suggestions. And I'm going to, one last slide, which I will talk about. Just be careful about overreaching. Anticipate there can be backlashes. Certainly what went on in the 60s was sometimes counterproductive. For the riots, certainly were counterproductive. Have concrete goals. One of the things that Saul Alinsky said, when you're organizing, set some goal that you can get. Because once you win something, you've got followers who say, "Yeah, we can win," and then you can build on that. If you set the goal at something which won't be reached for 50 years, you're not going to draw a lot of followers. And that, I think, the witness to the success of setting a goal of increasing minimum wages to $15. You have victories in various places. It's a very discrete goal. It's not going to cure inequality. It'll make some improvement. There's evidence that it does help wages, but because it's something very specific that people can take some. So the protest has a goal. It's likely to be more effective and victorious. And it's important to join others, and so I just threw on this last slide things that you can join. The indivisible is sort of patterned from the Tea Party. It's a national network which was established very quickly after the Trump's election. We have a local chapter here, CNY Solidarity. Some people from the Maxwell School are involved in it. A lot of local people in various settings. It meets weekly, or sometimes a little less frequently than weekly. There are many subcommittees working on local issues, state issues, national issues. Every Monday we get our marching instructions, who to call, because a lot of calls on a single day indicates more power than a call, which I make occasionally just to feel better for having called. So I say, and then there are a lot of other organizations. I give you the website for Indivisible, the local chapter for it, and I say keep fighting. Better. Okay, I'm through. I got time for real discussion, and I'm going to give you footnotes. So if you want to talk about any of these, some of the evidence for what I said, you'll find it in these books.
So Lou, not everybody in the room is familiar with the constructive approach to fighting conflicts. So I just wondered if you'd spend
all right. You mean you haven't read Constructive Conflicts yet?
My students have read it.
Yours, okay. All right. Well, I don't want to. All right. I'll briefly. Actually, with Bruce Dayton, this book has gone through 5 editions now, and Bruce has joined in the last 2 editions, and one of his contributions was to say we ought to set up some principles in one list. So the list varies from edition and occasion, but they're basic ideas that to recognize some of the things I've noted, that conflicts are interconnected. They're not isolated. Everybody's got a lot of different conflicts going on at the same time. Conflicts are not only waged by coercion. Conflicts can be done in a way that everybody's benefited at the end. And anybody who's in love with somebody who's had a fight knows that sometimes things are better afterwards. Things are understood and learned, and mutual agreements can be reached. But that requires paying attention, thinking about the other side, listening to the other side, and seeing where there are some commonalities or some trade-offs that can be made. Well, I think that's enough. Read more or talk about more.